Hello all. I was told we have to start on time. So it's 1:45. I'm expecting more people will drift in, but that'll be all right. If it gets noisy outside, we'll close the door. So I'm just going to read this, but anyway, if you're going to the other ones, it's all the same except for the name. So my name is Andrea, and I'm going to be the host of this morning's session. The name of the session is Short-Term Missions for Long-Term Impact. I don't know if any of you have ever gone on a short-term mission. I just want you to know that's actually my job in the mission I work with. And yesterday I got 5 people approved to go to Romania to help with refugees. So this is a very interesting topic for me. Before I introduce our presenter, I want you to know that this session is being live streamed on 6 satellite sites in Ontario, Manitoba, North Dakota. It's also available to anyone who has registered and downloaded the Mission Fest Manitoba app. So just so you know, your image may appear on the live stream broadcast. And if you don't absorb all the content and you like to go back, you can go back. There are videos of each session that will be on the Mission Fest YouTube channel. Our presenter today is Dr. Paul Smith. Dr. Smith is the academic dean at Nipawin Bible College, where he has served for the past 2 years. He has also served as international trainer with Training Leaders International for many years. In his role as an international trainer with TLI, Dr. Smith travels countries around the world where he provides training for ministry leaders. Please give Dr. Smith a warm, unfortunately, and wet Manitoba welcome as he presents.
Thank you. I was slightly worried for a moment there. I thought you were about to take over the teaching the short-term missions for long-term impact, but I was going to be fine with that. I was about to take notes. So let me just briefly explain why I think this is important and why you should kind of listen to me. So I've kind of made a career out of short-term missions. I've been on at least one short-term mission trip every year since 2009. I've been to 16 different countries, 5 different different continents. Traveled by myself, traveled to groups of 15 or more. Trips ranging from less than a week to 4 months. So I've had a fairly wide band of experience of traveling on short-term ministry trips. And clearly, I think they can be done well, or else I wouldn't have wasted all my time for many years and a lot of money. On the other hand, you'll probably pick up as we go through this that I also think they can be done really badly. And so I think all of us would agree we would prefer them to be done really well than really badly. And so how can we do that? What steps can we take as goers, as senders, as people who are financially supporting missionaries, who short-term missions, who are praying for them? What kind of steps can we take to help, as much as possible, build a successful short-term missions that's actually advancing the kingdom of God and being helpful? To just kind of set the stage here, so I looked up some statistics of short-term missions in Canada. The most recent statistics for Canada specifically that I could find was from a report by the Canadian Evangelical Association, Canadian Evangelical Fellowship in 2017. So 2/3 of evangelical Canadian pastors have gone on a short-term mission trip in the last 10 years. Again, this is as of 2017. 1/5 of all Canadian evangelical Christians have gone on a short-term trip. So that's lay people. Numbers are higher in the West. They're higher among young people. They're higher among people who attend weekly service. And if you are here at a missions conference in Manitoba, my guess is at least 2 of those categories fit you. the Yun and the higher in the West and weekly service attenders. Average spent per person, and I'm slightly rounding here, $1,750 per person being spent to go on short-term mission trip. 75% of these mission trips are under 14 days. 32% are under 7 days. If we include the United States here, because of course Canadians and Americans are basically the same, right? We have over, and this is like, you get a range because honestly a lot of these statistics people are kind of guessing, but you have at least 1.5 million people every year going on short-term trips. And I've seen numbers as high as 4, which, certainly seems high to me, but maybe I guess that's what people say. And they're spending, again, kind of floor of the estimates, $2 billion every year on short-term missions. So again, if just thinking of those numbers, and that's just the United States, again, and Canada also having a pretty central part to how we're viewing missions. For a lot of people, when they think of missions, this is what they're thinking about, right? For a lot of people, the money that they're giving, the hours that they're putting in, is short-term missions. Now, I will say at the beginning of this that I'm not pitting short-term missions against long-term missions. I'm not saying like, oh, we're spending $2 billion on short-term missions when we could use that to support, 1,000 more missionaries long-term. I'm not going to pit that. My philosophy is going to be, let's make a bigger pie, right? If we, right? There's plenty of resources that God owns that the pie is big enough. We just need to grow the pie if we need it. So that's not going to be my concern. My concern is, if we're spending $2 billion plus on short-term missions, how do we make sure that we are good stewards of that $2 billion plus, all right? So all that to say is STM's short-term ministries, I assume all of you know if I abbreviate that STM, that's what I'm talking about. So are STMs worth the time and worth the cost? Or to better fit the purpose of this session, since we are already investing that much time and that much cost, that much money in short-term ministries, how do we ensure that what we're already investing is a good investment? How do we make sure that we're doing good, buying good stocks and not the penny stocks that are going to make us bankrupt when the market crashes, right? Now, again, this is kind of my preemptive warning that my instinct is at this time to say, oh, let's see what the Bible says. And that's obviously a good starting point to go, right? Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But also, as I'm sure you're well aware, STM in the Bible is kind of like church services in the Bible, right? Yes, we may be able to glean some general principles, but we don't get a blueprint. We don't get a step-by-step guide where if we just do this, this, and this, boom, everything's perfect, right? Again, the Bible doesn't tell, should we have 3 psalms or 4 psalms, right? Where in the church service do we have the offering, right? Like, it just doesn't go in that kind of detail. That's not what the Bible was designed to do. And similarly, with short-term missions, I think that there's some biblical principles, and biblical theological principles that we will certainly need to wrestle with, but also we should come to grips with the fact that it's not going to give us a step-by-step guide of this, awesome STM, this, horrible STM, don't go on it, right? Now, all that is to say is, we're going to require biblical wisdom, right? We're going to require wisdom, which is drawing from basing our decisions on biblical theological principles, but also drawing on experience, best practices, and those sorts of things to make a biblically wise decision. And so everything that I'm going to say in this session, I'm going to present to you or offer to you as I think this, based off my reading in the Bible and my experiences, I suggest that this is a wise course of action, but I guess we're all wise in our own eyes, so feel free, and as you're listening to this, to think, I think that this may actually be a better, or, I think his experiences have led him a little astray on this one. I think he'd be better off over there. And certainly, I am open to that. Now, again, before all this is just kind of the introduction stage, but I will want to mention, just because I feel as I read, especially people who've invested in long-term ministries, again, there's almost like a little rivalry that goes on, right? Long-term missions, that's the only real missions, right? Fair. Again, I'm not here to argue with that, and lots of great long-term missions has been done. But all that is to say, I do want to remind us that there are multiple narrative examples of short-term ministries in the Bible, right? Jonah, the whole book of Jonah, right? That is an example of a short-term missions. Jonah did not pack up and live and move to Nineveh and learn the language and, wear their clothing and preach the gospel there. No, he was there for like a day, right? That's a short-term ministry trip, right? Jesus sending out the 70. The entire book of Acts is basically just a narrative account of multiple short-term missions trips, whether that's Peter to Cornelius or whether that's Paul traveling around the Mediterranean, right? So all that to say is, again, while I don't think these narratives are giving us a step-by-step, but I do think that there are several weighty, meaty biblical passages that, kind of show that there is indeed a role for short-term ministries, right? So we don't have to feel like we have to apologize for short-term missions, right? Like it's the JV squad to the long-term missions varsity missionary squad. No, I think there's a biblical role and pattern that gives us confidence that we actually have biblical warrant to do short-term missions. I guess that's kind of all I want to communicate about that is just, we do have biblical support for why we should be doing this. Though again, in a way that's going to require wisdom because it doesn't give us Paul doesn't sit down and say, now when you go on short-term ministries like me, here's what you should do. Certainly would make my job easier, but alas, they do not consult me when writing the Bible. All right, when we think of short-term ministries, there's basically two questions that are then just going to launch the rest of the questions that we're going to ask. Who are the stakeholders? And when we talk about long-term impact, who are we wanting the long-term impact with? Now, those answers to those two questions are going to have a lot of overlap, right? So just kind of brainstorm for me for a second. Stakeholders. You guys know what I mean, stakeholders, right? So who are the stakeholders of short-term ministries? Feel free to call out. We can pretend like we're Pentecostals for a moment and speak. So who are some stakeholders? Local church. Good. Who else? Sorry, say that. The person going, yeah, the individual going. The families of the people who are going. Yeah, the communities that they're going to. Foreign missionaries who are located at the place. Local churches both here, but also there, right? Christians both here and there, right? Those who are financially giving, those who are praying, right? So we see we have like a lot of people who are actually really, really invested in making sure short-term ministries is done well. None of those groups is sitting around thinking like, whatever. We have plenty of money to burn. We have plenty of time to burn. It doesn't really matter, whatever. Like, actually, we have a lot of people who are heavily invested in making sure that we're doing a good job. All right? So what does that mean? So let's kind of take that second question of, all right, so all those people are invested in making sure it succeeds, and so should be willing at some level to invest time and money to make sure they succeed. So when we talk about short-term missions for a long-term impact, where or what areas are we looking for that long-term impact? Again, we're going to see that there's a lot of overlap with the group we just mentioned, right? The goers we want to see some long-term impact in those who are going on the trip. The place that they're going, we want to see a long-term impact on the place that they're going. The churches that are both sending and receiving, we want to see long-term impact in that, right? And so for the rest of this session, I just want to take those kind of three groups. So I'm just going to call it the field, and I assume that in a missions conference when I talk about the field, that all of you are at least vaguely aware of what I'm talking about, right? Like where they're going, the place that they're going. So how do we ensure that there's long-term impact, or at least set ourselves up for a better chance of having a long-term impact in the field? And then the church, and specifically here I'm thinking of the local church that the person, the goer is coming from. And as I'm sure, again, all of you are well aware, a lot of local churches specifically will send mission groups as delegates, as, we are sending you. So local churches, what does the long-term impact in a local church look like? And then the individuals. I'll treat that fairly expansively of the ones who are actually going, who I'll spend most of my time, but also think through the individuals who are supporting them in various, whether it's finances or prayer. So again, taking those three categories, the field, the church, the individuals, what questions do we need to think through, and maybe what steps do we need to take to ensure that we're seeing as much as we can, because obviously the moment we talk about long-term impact, we're already acknowledging that we're going to need the Holy Spirit for that, right? But as much as we, as biblically informed, theologically informed, wise people, as much as possible, how can we do our part to ensure a long-term impact? So let's start with the field. And I'm going to start with a story that is told by a ministry leader in Mali, which is in West Africa, a guy named David. I've heard this story repeated in several different contexts, so I'm just trusting that the place that I've read it is accurate in identifying this story originally with David. If not, I can only tell you who I heard it from, right? So this story is attributed to a ministry leader in Mali named David. And it's the story of the elephant and the mouse. And one day, the mouse decides to throw a party. And he invites all sorts of animals to his house to party with him. And one of the animals that he invites to his house to party with him is the elephant. So all the animals gather from near, from far. They're eating, they're drinking, they're singing, drinking non-alcoholic beverages, just to be clear. They're singing, they're dancing. Dancing, boy. I realize that this probably was not the best illustration to use with this audience. But they're singing, they're dancing, they're eating, they're enjoying the party. And one of the people who is enjoying the party is the elephant. And no one is dancing more energetically than the elephant. Clearly not a Baptist, right? And after the party was over, the elephant kind of is like so excited. He just had a great time. And he says, "Mouse, have you ever been to a better party than this? This was the best party I've ever gone. What a blast." But the mouse did not answer him. The elephant looks around and says, "Wait, mouse, where are you?" And he looks around and he can't find the mouse. And then suddenly he looks down and he kind of shrinks back in horror, because there at his feet lay the mouse. His body was grounded into the dirt by the elephant dancing. And the ministry leader in Mali said, sometimes this is like what it is to do missions with you in North America. That we, the mouse, invite you over to our house, and you, like the elephant, have a great time. You're doing your things. You're only thinking about yourself, and you don't realize how you are smashing us into the ground. I tell that story because I think it helps focus our minds on when we're thinking about long-term impact, what should we be prioritizing? The same survey that I mentioned earlier about the Canadians by the Evangelical Canadian Fellowship, same survey asked the question of pastors and church and lay people in Canada, what is the primary, most important reason for doing short-term ministries? Half of the lay people and 2/3 of the pastors think that the primary purpose of STMs is the spiritual growth of the goers. Half of the Canadian lay people, 2/3 of the Canadian pastors think the primary purpose of STM trips is for the spiritual growth of the ones who are going on the trip. That mindset is like the elephant dancing in the mouse's house, right? The elephant had a great time, and that's all they thought about. Not realizing or caring about what their good time, what their spiritual growth is doing to the mouse. And of course, we could say in missions, it might even be a worse case than the scenario, the story that I described, because at least in the story I described, the elephant actually asked about the mouse. He looked for the mouse, right? Many of our STMs will go over and trample the mouse and not even realize that we've trampled the mouse. And we'll come back with our photos and pat ourselves on the back and say, good job, us, without realizing we have just smashed the mouse's house to bits. I'm going to come back to that kind of idea of the primary purpose of STMs, that shocking, it's not really shocking to me, the self-centeredness of the primary purpose of sending STM is for my own spiritual benefit. I'm going to come back to that. That's obviously going to be really key to a lot of things that we're going to be thinking through as we think through long-term impact. But I set that up to say, I'm going to suggest that our primary thought when it comes to long-term impact needs to be about the field. Now again, that's not to say that there isn't other benefits to STM. I think there are other benefits to STM. But I think at the very least we need to center the people who we're claiming to minister to. And that's going to maybe, for some of us, require rethinking how we do STMs and what that looks like. Think about STM trips, either ones that you personally have gone on or ones that you've seen go out from your church. What is the relationship between the field where you're going, or where your church is going, where they're being sent, where your mission's sending people, and you? And again, both you as an individual, but also you as the church, right? I've been around, right? I've been around in my day, right? And I've been in many churches where the relationship is basically, oh yeah, we thought we met someone at a conference somewhere, and we thought, oh, it would be great to send people, and we sent people, and then they came back, and the end, the trip's over. And there's absolutely zero relationship either prior to or after, right? That honestly is not going to contribute to long-term health. Where are you in the stage of the relationship? All relationships have to start somewhere, right? That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to say, hey, I want to send a team to a location where we don't really have that much of a relationship. It's just the beginning. That's not a bad thing because all relationships need to start somewhere. The key difference is what stage of the relationship you're in determines or helps determine what your goal should be. If you say, well, we don't really have a relationship, but we want to, you probably shouldn't send 20 people over there. That's probably not the best way to start out a relationship by saying, oh yeah, by the way, can you host 20 people and make sure that they're all engaged and they're doing something and none of them are sick, and that's probably not the best way to start out a relationship. You may want to start the relationship by sending 1, 2, 3 people. Why? because they're the ones, because it's a small group, they can actually like sit down face to face, right? Talk, actually develop a relationship. If you've ever been in a large group, I've mentioned that some of the STM groups I've been in is like 15 people. And at the end of a week or 2 weeks that I'm with 15 people, like I know everyone's name, but that's basically it. Like I can look at people and be like, I've never talked with you in the 2 weeks I've been here with you, right? That's just the function of a 15-member group. I've also traveled on groups where there's 2 people or 3 people, and you have a lot better chance, not just chance, like unless you just lock yourself in a room, you're going to interact with them more. You're going to develop a relationship more, right? And so if you're thinking through, how do I develop a relationship with the field, smaller people are going to have an easier time to develop that relationship than a large group, right? Now, another kind of reason, just kind of thinking wisdomly of why you might want to send a small group originally is because if you don't have a relationship with them, you probably don't actually know what they need. And so you're just going to have to develop a relationship of trust before they're going to trust you to actually help them with what they need help with. If any of you have ever had any substantial interactions with people around the world, or there's often, not always, but often there's an imbalance, right? There's an imbalance of power. Sometimes that's just an imbalance of power because that's what's expected on their end. Like, oh, sometimes it's an imbalance of power because there's resources, right? You have resources, they don't. They want those resources for obvious and some usually good reasons. And so if you say, hey, I want to bring 15 youth group with us, and they're thinking in their minds, well, I don't really need 15, but if they bring 15, then they might also bring money with them, and then that'll be able to finance what I really need to do, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, come on over. We'll host you. Well, is that what the field needs? No. Well, but no. Or at least it's not the best practice. It's not the best thing that they need. But you're not going to learn what they really need until you build that relationship. There's a relationship of trust. And that might take a while. And that's okay. And that may take what, from some perspectives, might seem like a giant waste of money, right? Thinking, we're going to send 2, 3 people over to wherever, and they're just going to, what are they going to be doing? Are they going to be, they're just going to be talking with people. They have an invention called a phone if you just want to talk to people. Well, that's not really going to develop the relationship that we need. We're going to need to actually sit down with them and share food with them and see their homes and see where they're working. And to use an overused phrase, share a little bit of their life. And we may have to go back 3, 4 times, 5 times, which may look like a giant waste of money, but that's going to be what's needed if we want to have a long-term impact. Because without a relationship, our chances of having a long-term impact are severely decreasing. Beginning of April, I just traveled to Ghana in West Africa for just a couple days. Extremely expensive. It was a last-minute booking, flight booking, so it just, way more cost than it should because it was last-minute booking. The reason I was there was because it was a funeral. What did I do? Well, I did some stuff, but generally I did nothing. Did I just waste a whole bunch of money by going over just to do nothing? Not really. Because my presence there is sowing relationship seeds that is going to benefit long term. And unfortunately, sometimes when we think of STMs, we aren't thinking of long term. we aren't thinking of, I'm going to do some stuff that short-term sounds stupid, but it's because I know 5 years from now, that's actually going to help me. So what's your relationship with Field? What stage is it in the relationship? How long are you planning to have the relationship? Again, I'm not a prophet, maybe you guys are, but I can't necessarily foresee. But also you generally have an idea of, no, this is just going to be a one-time, one-off thing versus ideally we'd like to come back every year for the next 5 years. That's different, right? And you're going to do different things based off how you're viewing that. All that is not the only reason you're building a relationship. There's obviously good inherent reasons for building a relationship, right? We are a body, and being connected to the body is inherently good. That's an inherently good thing. But also, there's kind of side benefits to that inherently good thing. And one of the side benefits is our relationship we're developing a true partnership or a one-way street? Are you actually listening? And I will tell you, as someone who is a North American, who again interacts a lot with people who are not from North America, it is extremely easy, both on their end and my end, for me to come in and be the boss. That is extremely, extremely easy thing to do. Are you listening to what they're saying? Are you even asking them to talk so you can listen to what they're saying? If you read a lot about STMs, you tend to see several stories that all basically sound the same, and you're like, are they all just repeating the same story? And no, it's just, this happens all the time, and so everyone's got their own kind of variation of the story. This particular story that I was reading, the person that they were sending asked for 3 skilled people. So there's a certain thing that they wanted to do in construction, and they just didn't have any skilled people to do that construction, so they asked, can you send us 3 people who are skilled in this particular task of construction to come over and help us in this task? The church said, great, no problem, we'll love to do it. They sent over 15 youth, none of them had ever done construction before. You're not listening. And then those 15 youth, I'm sure, went around, took a lot of pictures, came back, did their report to the church, showed the smiling faces of them, and said, great trip. And, I wasn't on that trip, so maybe it was a great trip, but it didn't do anything of lasting value for the field, because you're not listening to the field. Part of this relationship, when we're thinking of the field, we're thinking both of national people, and we're also thinking of often long-term missionaries. Is your experience of the field mediated through long-term missionaries? Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but also it's something that you got to be aware of if it's happening or not happening. Long-term missionaries have certain views, certain biases, certain, agenda. And again, I'm not saying that in a negative sense, but just to say we need to recognize that fact. They will generally show you what they want to show you that best fits what they want to show you, if that makes sense. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that you need to be aware of. This kind of leads us to a giant question, and this is one that's argued about all the time. Is it better to send people or money? Again, this has, you read people, and again, different stories, but all generally the same story. Story of a church that spends $20,000 to send 15 people to paint an orphanage in Guatemala. The orphanage of Guatemala, its entire yearly budget is $45,000. The church just spent $20,000 to send 15 people to paint it, when they could have hired a local for $200, got that painted, and then given almost 6 months worth of a yearly budget as a gift to the orphanage if they so chose, right? And so that kind of scenario leads a lot of people to say, don't even bother going on STM trips. Like, don't take the money that you would have given and just give it directly to the place, give it directly to the nationals. Don't spend the money to fly people over, to spend all that money. And I think we can all see how that might actually be a really strong argument. Like, that sounds pretty valid, right? It's at least something that we should be considering. There's also other reasons. If you're familiar, some of you may not be, When Helping Hurts. That's a pretty standard book that I think missionaries tend to recommend quite a bit. Just talking through the issue of, well, did it really help that place to have foreigners come and paint it when they could have invested in the local economy by hiring locals to paint, right? This kind of, again, I'm just merely raising this issue. I'm definitely not going to get in this fight. But I raise this issue just as a launching point to think through the issue of STM as relief or development. Many of the STM trips as we currently do it are relief. So I was in Haiti a couple years ago, and Haiti just has so many STM people go there. Usually, the places I go, like, I'm the only white person I ever see, but in Haiti, it was like around every corner, like, there are a lot. And so the hotel I was at had an STM group from the United States that happened to be staying at the same hotel I was staying at. And so I was asking them, oh yeah, what are you doing? Well, what they were doing, I think they had maybe like 10 in their group, and they were handing out bottled water on the street. So 10 people, none of them knew Creole, none of them knew the language, handing out bottles of water on the street. That would be an example of relief, right? You're kind of, whether the people did or did not need water bottles, we can ignore that for the point that I'm trying to make. But they're just doing something that's going to be short-term. Even if they need the water, it's just one water bottle, they'll drink it, and it's done, right? When you leave, if indeed they truly needed water, then when you leave, they're still going to need water, right? Again, the painting the orphanage, same thing, right? It's a relief effort, a construction, relief effort. Most STM trips are relief efforts. Relief efforts, by the very nature, tend to be very short-term impact. Some places need relief efforts. If it's a place after an earthquake or war, or, those places need relief efforts. Does Haiti, 2 years after the earthquake that did need relief effort, did it still need people to come in and distribute water bottles? Or did they need more development, whether that looked like wells being dug or, whatever that might look like? What would an STM trip look like if we're focused on developing rather than just meeting an immediate need? Now, obviously, that's going to require different skills. Anybody off the street can hand out a water bottle. That doesn't take much skills at all. Digging a well might take some specific skills. Training other people how to dig a well might require even more skills. Development tends to require more skilled stuff, which honestly speaking is why STMs usually don't do it. Because we honestly tend to send unskilled people. I'll get in that probably in a little bit. I think one of the big questions that we should be asking, overarching questions we should be asking when we're thinking of the field and long-term development in the field is, how is what we're doing right now supporting local churches? If they're not supporting local churches, then I can almost guarantee you it's not really going, it may have a long-term impact, but it's not going to have a Christian long-term impact, if that distinction makes sense, right? If you're digging a well, that may have a long-term impact, but if it's not supporting a local church, that's not having a long-term Christian impact. It still may be a good impact. I'm not like bashing that. I'm not saying you should even not do that. I'm just saying as Christians, as churches, we should hopefully be thinking of how can I do a long-term Christian impact in addition to maybe, all the other good impacts that are good, right? So again, I'm not bashing like all the other stuff, I'm just suggesting we hopefully should really be connecting these things to supporting local churches. And if we're supporting local churches, then we're almost naturally building ourselves into being able to have a long-term impact, because the local churches are the ones that are going to have the long-term impact. And so anything we can do to empower and strengthen local churches is going to have almost, again, by necessity, a long-term impact. Because, again, that's kind of how God's working in the world, is through local churches. That's the field, and we could talk a lot more about that, but let me just try to move on. Try. I won't get sucked back in. The church. How can we think through in your local church? So here I'm specifically thinking of the local church that you are in. How can we ensure that STM, whether that's the church sending out STMs or whether that's individual people in your congregation just going on their own as STMs, how can all those be used to help strengthen the opportunity to perform a long-term impact in the local church? So one of the things, and probably the first thing that we need to think about in answering that question, is how does the STM fit within the larger vision of the church? In my experience, it is very often that STM trip will only get mentioned when it's time to go on an STM or recruit on an STM. So let's just use as an example, a church decides we're going to send a STM group to Mexico. And the only time Mexico is mentioned in that church is when it's time to recruit for that trip, and maybe 1 week when they come back, we'll give them a 1-week report. But it's not being incorporated into the very soul of the church. There's no get up this week and we are going to pray for Mexico, right? There's no incorporating that into what is the vision, what is the purpose of the church? Is the country, is the partners that they're partnering with to send people to, again, in this example, Mexico, are we praying for them regularly? Or do we just pray for them when we send the people, when our people are there? Is there regular updates to demonstrate that things are actually happening without me? Or am I the star of every mention? Is everything forgotten 2 weeks after the trip? What intentional steps are being taken by the church, by the people in the church, to ensure that the STM thing isn't just a, woo, that was great, but is actually something that the church is committed and demonstrating that commitment to? It's easy for us to say that, oh, well, we send a group to Mexico every year, so we're committed to Mexico. Okay, but prove it to me. Where's your commitment, not just when it's convenient for you and when you're getting something out of it, but where's your commitment when it hurts, when you actually have to sacrifice something? And again, I'm not even talking at this point about finances. I'm just talking about in our natural life of the church, where is it? For those of you who are like, I don't have any control over that. If you go on an STM trip, just go to the pastor, go to church leader, elder, whoever, however your church is set up, and just ask. Just say, hey, you've agreed to send me to fill in the blank. Can you support me by, and then make the ask, by agreeing that for the next year, you will ask someone in the church service to pray for this country. So, some of this stuff you might be like, I'm not a leader, I can't do that. Just ask. Anyway. Second thing, long-term impact with the church. Is the church doing its job of vetting people? STMs, because they're primarily seen as spiritual formation for the participants, as I mentioned, the surveys show, then there's a grab bag of people who are being sent. It's basically a whoever shows up, we will send you. This includes, by the way, even non-Christians. So that same survey that I've been referring to, almost 2/3 of Canadians think unsaved people should be allowed to go to STM trips. I will definitely not get in that argument, but other than to say, there are plenty of ministries in the church where the church feels like we have to vet you before we allow you. We have to vet you before we allow you to work with our kids. We have to vet you before we allow you to preach in our pulpits. We have to vet you, the church has no problem vetting people for a lot of different roles. And yet suddenly when it comes to STM, it's like, oh yeah, come on, who cares, right? Perhaps, maybe, I will suggest, churches should take on the responsibility of vetting. Now, I will quickly add to that, that does not mean that we're excluding, but simply to say, and this is kind of now moving to my third point of individuals, is if we do indeed want to disciple people on these trips, we probably shouldn't have 15 people we need to disciple to one person who's doing the discipling. If we have one person who needs to be discipled paired with one person who can disciple, that's a realistic expectation, right? So maybe, sure, let in someone who is unskilled or whatever, a little spiritually immature, but make sure that they're paired with a spiritually mature person who can focus on and not have to worry about, oh, actually, I have 10 spiritually immature people we have to focus on. Individual, and I'll try to rapidly because I think I'm almost at time here. The individual. Is STM trips actually producing long-term change in individuals? The answer is, nah. Studies have generally shown it's inconclusive. 1 year out, almost seems to be no change. Again, some studies may show a little bit of change, some show it's actually harmed a little bit, but generally speaking, when you take all the studies together, it's almost a flat line, but maybe possibly a little bit of help, long-term impact on an individual. More likely, so you increase your odds of creating a long-term impact if the person goes on multiple trips, which makes sense. It also drastically increases the likelihood of long-term impact if there's pre-trip meetings and post-trip meetings. And that's like, if I was going to say one piece of advice, that's just my one piece of advice that I would give is pre-trip meetings, post-trip meetings. Though that's a small change that can give you easily lasting impact. Again, what do those look like? Pre-trip things like culture, that can both help the field with the long term because you're not the clueless Canadian walking around, right? Unintentionally creating harm everywhere you go. But also then, again, that actually helps the individual because they're growing. Spiritual formation. If we're going to say that STM's one of the purposes, and I'm fine with saying one of the purpose is spiritual formation, let's actually do a good job of it. There's a problem. The problem is that we have a crisis theology of spiritual formation where if we put these people in a crisis situation, that crisis will provoke a sudden spiritual upheaval, and when that spiritual upheaval is done, they will, boom, suddenly be spiritually mature. And that's not how spiritual formation works. Spiritual formation actually takes time and effort. We can't just assume that, oh, they went on an STM trip, the experience itself is enough to form them. It's not. And so both pre-trip and post-trip, we actually have to take effort to be spiritually prepared, and then post to work through experience and connect it spiritually with the formation that's going on. And if we're not doing that, then we can say, oh yeah, we're spiritually forming these people because they went and they came back and they said, oh, it was awesome, it was great. But again, studies will show that and they will go right back to where they are, and we've just wasted an opportunity. All right. Again, I will just shut up now. I think that leaves us like maybe 5 minutes for questions, if I'm keeping track of time correctly. If there are plenty of resources, there are plenty of resources in the last 5-10 years. So many books, articles, blog posts, videos have been done about this topic. I'm more than happy if you want to be pointed in a direction to give you some, but otherwise I will do that and go for questions.
So I'm going to suggest, if you have questions, I've heard two conflicting time things. One has told me the time is up, and then something on the schedule said there's still a few more minutes. But perhaps if you have questions, they can just approach you for now.
That would be great.
Because in half an hour, another session will be here.
Yep.
So things that would interest me is, do we have an idea where people are going? Because I once heard of stats from the States that like 75% of the people go to Mexico. The other thing is, what are the people doing? And then you mentioned that about construction.
Yep.
I had a team want to go, and mostly our young people wanted to do construction, and we want to send teams to do a ministry that the missionary on the ground wants. So these are questions to think about, but please feel free. I'm sure Dr. Smith doesn't mind being around for a little bit.
Nope.
And you can approach him individually. I don't think he looks too scary.
Kind of. Well, in that case, I'll take this as the session being over, and I'll just kind of hang out in the front. So thanks for coming.